Let's rewind to suburban Australia in the 90s. The family Commodore's rattling into the local shopping strip, you snag a squeaky trolley with a wonky wheel, and step into a store that smells like cardboard, floor cleaner, and that one weird brand of deodorant nobody buys but everyone remembers. Welcome to Franklin's, the original Battlers supermarket. They had no music, no fake smiles, and no loyalty cards offering half a carrot after spending $500. Just cold, fluorescent lights, towering shelves, and prices so low they made Coles and Woolies sweat through their polo shirts. Where else could you get 10 cans of baked beans, 2 liters of cola, and a kilo of off-brand spaghetti for less than a movie ticket? It wasn't glamorous, far from it, but it got the job done. But now, it's completely gone, wiped out from the retail map like it never existed. So how did Franklin's, once a suburban staple, end up on the wrong side of retail history? To really understand where Franklin's came from, we need to rewind all the way back to 1941 in Sydney. Australia was deep in the middle of World War II. Food was being rationed, the economy was tight, and everyday Australians were doing everything they could to stretch their money. It was in the middle of all of this that an American businessman named Frank Lindstrom opened a small grocery store in the inner city suburb of Surrey Hills. He wasn't aiming to build a retail empire or take on the major players. His goal was far simpler: to make groceries affordable. Lindstrom believed that there was a better way to do things, a smarter way to run a store that didn't involve passing on unnecessary costs to the consumer. So he tried something different. He opened a store that stripped away all the extras people were used to, like the soft lighting and background music. Customers walked in, found what they needed, packed their own bags, and paid a lower price because of it. Shoppers didn't care about all that polish or presentation. They cared that their money went further. In the minds of consumers, Franklin's offered something rare: a store that actually respected your budget. It didn't take long for word to spread, and within a few years, Franklin's had become the shop of choice for working class families across Sydney. If you were trying to feed a household on a budget, you knew exactly where to go. By the 1950s, Australia was changing fast. The population was booming, suburbs were spreading, and shopping habits were shifting along with them. But while other retailers chased more modern layouts and bigger product ranges, Franklin's stayed focused on what worked. It stuck to its simple model and quietly expanded its presence across New South Wales. Through the 1960s, that quiet expansion turned into serious momentum. Franklin's had grown from a single wartime store into a widely recognized chain, embedded in the weekly routines of families across the state. Its approach hadn't changed much since World War II, but that was part of the appeal. Shoppers came in expecting low prices, and Franklin's always delivered. By the late 1970s, Franklin's had grown from a regional success story into a serious national player. Its No Frills approach to grocery retail had found a permanent place in Australian life, and by the time the 1980s rolled around, it was hard to find a suburb that didn't have a Franklin's tucked somewhere near the local shops. The chain eventually reached more than 280 stores across the country, making it the third largest supermarket brand in Australia, sitting behind only Woolies and Coles. Where its competitors leaned into branding, advertising, and reward schemes, Franklin's just kept things lean. The stores stayed basic, the signage was blunt, and the focus never shifted away from keeping prices as low as possible. Their slogan was "more in your trolley for less," and they were very serious about it. A trip to Franklin's meant you walked out with more food, more household essentials, and more leftover change than if you'd gone anywhere else. One of the biggest reasons for that was the introduction of Franklin's own line of home brand products, known simply as No Frills. Launched in 1978, No Frills became one of the most recognizable private label brands in the country. The packaging was intentionally plain, almost comically so. The products were wrapped in white backgrounds with stark black text and absolutely nothing else. No mascots, no colorful labels, no smiling farmers, or fake gold ribbons claiming award-winning taste. A can of beans said baked beans, and a roll of paper towels said paper towels. That was it. The plain design meant production costs were kept at a minimum. No Frills products were significantly cheaper than the branded alternatives sitting on the same shelves, and in many cases, the difference in quality wasn't nearly as wide as the gap in cost. If you were trying to save a few bucks, this was your best option, and it wasn't even that bad. This approach gave Franklin's an edge, especially in areas where disposable income was tight. Families on a budget would plan their entire weekly shop around the store. You'd pick up all the basics, then stop off elsewhere for anything Franklin's didn't stock. Over time, the No Frills line expanded into hundreds of product categories, covering almost every aisle in the store. It wasn't uncommon to fill an entire trolley with nothing but No Frills items. In a way, the brand became its own identity, separate from Franklin's, yet inseparable from the shopping experience. This strategy also helped Franklin's carve out a loyal customer base that didn't care about in-store ambience or a polished shopping experience. They were there because Franklin's delivered consistent value week after week without pretending to be something that it wasn't. It was honest in a way that most retailers simply weren't. But with success came new challenges. As Franklin's grew larger and more visible, it started attracting attention from the top end of town. The major players, Coles and Woolies, were watching closely. They'd already been competing for dominance, but now Franklin's was starting to chip away at their lower income customer base, and that was a problem. So, while Franklin's continued doing what it did best, the giants started preparing to push back. They had more money, better infrastructure, and far more flexibility to modernize. They weren't about to let a stripped back budget chain keep carving up market share without a fight. But behind the scenes, big changes were happening. In 1978, Franklin's was bought by Pick n Pay, a major South African supermarket giant looking to expand its reach. They had deep pockets, international retail experience, and a bold vision for growth. With new ownership came big ambitions. Franklin's began expanding into new states, trialing new product lines, and upgrading its systems to match the big players. For a while, it looked like the brand might finally level up. As the 1990s rolled in, the supermarket landscape in Australia began to shift rapidly. Coles and Woolies were now moving aggressively to modernize their operations and polish their image. They weren't just selling groceries anymore. They were curating a shopping experience. Their stores started to feel brighter, cleaner, and more carefully designed. Behind the scenes, they were also investing heavily in their supply chains, IT systems, and inventory management. Quiet changes that made their operations smoother, more efficient, and more scalable. Franklin's, meanwhile, was under growing pressure to respond. It couldn't match the big two in terms of capital or infrastructure, but it needed to find a way to stay relevant in a market that was clearly evolving. Holding steady on low prices wasn't enough anymore, especially as competitors began introducing their own budget lines and using loyalty programs to retain customers. In response, Franklin's launched a new wave of store formats. The first was Franklin's Fresh, which focused on upgrading the fresh food offering with more fruit and veg, better presentation, and a less industrial feel overall. It was a clear attempt to attract shoppers who were starting to expect higher standards in layout and quality, even from discount stores. But the real curveball was the launch of Franklin's Big Fresh. Big Fresh was bold, unusual, and very unlike anything Franklin's had tried before. Inspired by a New Zealand concept from the Food Town chain, it turned parts of the store into something close to a themed attraction. You'd walk past animatronic chickens clucking near the egg section, talking vegetables cracking puns from display bins, and cows that mooed while you picked up your milk. The stores also added in-house bakeries, ready-to-eat items, and more appealing displays, aiming to blend the traditional Franklin's pricing approach with a more enjoyable atmosphere. In some locations, especially in suburban centers with families and younger children, Big Fresh found its audience. It created buzz, drove foot traffic, and briefly gave Franklin's a fresh identity in a crowded market. But not every store was a hit. While the novelty attracted attention, it didn't always translate into loyalty. For longtime Franklin shoppers, those who had stuck with the food chain for its practicality and low prices, they weren't necessarily looking for a theatrical shopping experience. They wanted quick, cheap, and predictable. Singing bananas and robotic cows didn't change the fact that the broader Franklin's range was still limited compared to what Woolies or Coles could offer, especially in categories like fresh meat, international foods, or premium household products. On top of that, rolling out and maintaining big fresh locations wasn't cheap. The cost of upgrading stores, building custom displays, and keeping the novelty factor going ate into the already thin margins that discount chains operated on. While the idea helped Franklin's briefly rebrand itself as something more than just No Frills, it also highlighted a deeper problem where the business was trying to be something it wasn't. The tension between staying true to its original identity and chasing a more modern, experience-based model created confusion, both internally and among customers. Some stores stuck with the traditional layout, others went full big fresh, and others still were somewhere in between. As Franklin's experimented, the big players stayed focused, continuing to refine their operations and widen the gap. The charm of Big Fresh couldn't fix everything. While it was clever, it wasn't enough to address the underlying issues Franklin's was facing. The supermarket wars weren't being won with animatronics. They were being won with logistics, efficiency, and data, and that's where Franklin's was falling behind. As Franklin's moved further into the 2000s, its identity crisis only deepened. The company had spent years experimenting with different store formats in a scramble to stay competitive, but in doing so, it began to lose the one thing that had always set it apart: clarity. This lack of consistency created uncertainty for customers who increasingly didn't know what to expect. Some came looking for low prices and left unimpressed by higher than expected totals. Others expected a more modern setup and were greeted by dated interiors and sparse shelves. Brand loyalty, which had once been Franklin's quiet strength, started to erode. Behind the scenes, the problems ran deeper. The need to support multiple store models was extremely complex and expensive. Managing stock across a fragmented chain was becoming a logistical headache. Products weren't always available when they needed to be, deliveries were delayed, shelves sat half empty in key categories, and stores had to make do with inconsistent stock levels. Meanwhile, competition was intensifying on all fronts. Coles and Woolworths were streamlining their operations, their pricing became more competitive, and their stores were now more responsive to changing shopper habits. In other words, Coles and Woolworths were starting to pull away. To make matters worse, a new wave of discount retailers was entering the picture. In 2001, Australia met Aldi. It landed with a clear vision, a proven international model, and the operational precision to execute it. Aldi did what Franklin's used to do, but they did it better. Within a few years, Aldi became the new budget supermarket king. And while Aldi soared, Franklin's spiraled. Years of expansion, rebranding, and mixed messaging had taken their toll. The business was becoming harder to manage, and the return on all those reinvention efforts just wasn't adding up. Operational costs were rising, sales were softening, and the gap between Franklin's and its rivals was no longer something that could be closed with clever marketing or in-store gimmicks. The brand had lost its edge, and more importantly, it had lost its direction. It wasn't winning on price, on quality, and on customer experience. It was, in effect, stuck in a no man's land of retail, squeezed between competitors who each had a clearer pitch to the Australian public. It became clear to leadership that the business couldn't keep operating the way it was. What began as manageable internal issues and increasing competition had grown into something far more serious. After years of trying to hold the middle ground, Franklin's faced a turning point. It could scale back and restructure or risk falling apart entirely. By 2001, Pick n Pay had reached its limit and made the tough call that it was time to sell. But offloading the entire business as a single unit proved impossible. Franklin's was too fragmented, too inconsistent, and too far behind in key areas like logistics and supply chain integration to attract a single buyer. The only option left was to sell it off in pieces, store by store, site by site. The heavyweights wasted no time. Woolies and Coles jumped at the chance to secure high traffic locations and valuable retail real estate. Within months, dozens of former Franklin's stores had been absorbed into their networks, rebranded and relaunched under their banners. Aldi also picked up a handful of stores, expanding its growing Australian footprint. Its lean, efficient model allowed it to take on former Franklin's locations and quickly convert them into streamlined operations with minimal fanfare. But not every store was snapped up. Some were in awkward locations, others too small or outdated to justify major investment. That's where Metcash stepped in. Metcash is the wholesaler behind the IGA network, and they had a different strategy. Instead of absorbing Franklin's into an existing national brand, it decided to keep the name alive. Metcash only acquired about 80 stores, but it also acquired the Franklin's brand itself, betting that the name still held value in the minds of Australian shoppers. This was a bold move, but also a risky one. Franklin's had been in decline for years, and public perception had shifted. Still, Metcash saw potential in reviving the chain as a franchised model. Independently operated stores with centralized support, something similar to how IGAs functioned. The idea was to maintain Franklin's reputation for value while giving store owners more flexibility to cater to local needs. In the early years under Metcash, there were genuine efforts to bring the brand back to life. Stores were redesigned with updated layouts and more modern signage. New marketing campaigns leaned into a local but national message, trying to position Franklin's as both community-friendly and competitively priced. The companies pushed hard to reconnect with families who had grown up shopping there, hoping that nostalgia could translate into renewed loyalty. But the retail landscape had changed too much. By the time these efforts rolled out, shoppers had moved on. Franklin's, despite the fresh coat of paint, felt like a name from another era. Even with Metcash's backing, the revived Franklin's model couldn't compete at scale. Customers were no longer choosing supermarkets based on name alone. They expected efficiency, range, and price points that Franklin's simply couldn't keep up with. By 2012, Metcash pulled the plug. The remaining Franklin's stores were either closed, sold off, or rebranded under the IGA banner. The stores quietly disappeared, and just like that, a brand that had once stood as a staple of Australian suburban life was gone. For many families, it was the end of an era. Franklin's had been more than a store, it had been part of the weekly rhythm. Its fall wasn't just about business metrics, it marked the disappearance of something familiar, something woven into decades of everyday life. By the time the last store closed, the name had already faded from shopping lists, and for younger generations, it became little more than a faded memory. So, what killed Franklin's? It wasn't a single mistake or one dramatic collapse, but a slow decline shaped by changing times and missed opportunities. The supermarket industry kept evolving, but Franklin's couldn't keep pace. It failed to pick a lane. When it chased modernity, it lost its budget base. When it tried to pivot back to basics, Aldi had already claimed the throne. It suffered from inconsistent branding, patchy logistics, underinvestment in tech, and a growing identity crisis. But above all, Franklin's forgot its roots. It forgot what made it powerful in the first place: simplicity, consistency, and loyalty through savings. It's also a cautionary tale for retail brands trying to reinvent themselves by chasing trends. Sometimes, the strongest move is doubling down on your core, because once you lose clarity, you lose your customers. Despite its demise, Franklin's still has a weirdly warm place in Aussie hearts. There was something raw and authentic about Franklin's. It didn't woo you with fake smiles, it told you straight up, this is cheap, take it or leave it. And for decades, millions of Australians took it and were thankful for it. Today, as Coles and Woolies wage price wars and Aldi tightens its grip, it's worth remembering the little guy that did it first. Before scan and go, before QR codes, before Instagrammable avocados, there was Franklin's. It didn't survive the giants, but it made them better. It made them compete harder, and in doing so, it shaped the way Australians shop. So next time you fill your trolley with store brand pasta and knockoff Coke, pour one out for Franklin's. The OG battler, the budget brawler, the supermarket that gave everything and asked for nothing more than a coin in the trolley. But what do you think? Do you remember shopping at Franklin's? How would the grocery store landscape change had Franklin's stayed in business? Let us know your thoughts and more in the comment section below, and let's discuss. And if you enjoyed this story, give us a thumbs up, hit subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell so you never miss out on more deep dives like this. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, stay curious.